The shocking true story of the 1892 Lizzie Borden axe murders. How Andrew and Abby Borden were brutally killed in their Massachusetts home. Why Lizzie was tried for the double murder, acquitted, despite the evidence, and how the unsolved case became one of America's greatest criminal mysteries. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, the peaceful industrial city of Fall River, Massachusetts, awoke like countless mornings before it. Factory whistles echoed through the humid summer air, shopkeepers unlocked their doors, horse-drawn wagons rattled over the streets, and families settled into familiar routines. Yet before noon, news began spreading with astonishing speed that one of the city's wealthiest and most recognizable citizens had been hacked to death inside his own home. Moments later came an even more horrifying revelation. His wife had also been murdered, her body lying undiscovered upstairs. The brutality of the killings shocked even seasoned police officers. Blood stained the floors of the modest house on 2nd Street, and the weapon appeared to have been an ordinary household hatchet. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious robbery, and no clear suspect waiting outside. Instead, suspicion slowly turned inward, toward the very people who had shared the victim's home. Over the next century, the case would become one of America's most debated criminal mysteries, inspiring books, documentaries, films, academic studies, and endless speculation. Yet before investigators examined bloodstains, questioned witnesses, or debated courtroom testimony, there was another story unfolding quietly behind the walls of the Borden household, a story of money, resentment, family conflict, and emotional distance that many historians believe set the stage for one of the most infamous crimes in American history. To understand why the murders became so controversial, it is necessary to step back into Fall River as it existed during the closing years of the 19th century. At that time, Fall River was one of New England's booming textile centers. Massive cotton mills dominated the skyline, employing thousands of workers who streamed through the streets before sunrise and returned home exhausted after long shifts. The city represented both remarkable prosperity and harsh inequality. Wealthy industrialists built impressive homes while immigrant laborers crowded into modest neighborhoods close to the mills. Respectability, church attendance, and social reputation carried enormous importance. Families guarded their public image carefully, and scandals spread rapidly through churches, businesses, and local newspapers. Among Fall River's successful businessmen, Andrew Jackson Borden occupied a unique position. Born into a family of modest means, he had accumulated significant wealth through years of careful investment in real estate, banking, manufacturing interests, and commercial property. By the early 1890s, his fortune was estimated at several $100,000, an amount worth many millions in modern currency. Yet despite possessing the financial ability to enjoy a luxurious lifestyle, Andrew remained astonishingly frugal. Friends, neighbors, and business associates consistently described him as intelligent, disciplined, and financially brilliant, but also exceptionally tight-fisted. He disliked unnecessary spending, preferred practical clothing, and resisted modern conveniences that many affluent families considered standard. His house at 92 2nd Street reflected those values. Although located in a respectable neighborhood, it was neither grand nor fashionable, compared with the elegant homes occupied by other wealthy Fall River businessmen. The house lacked electricity and indoor plumbing despite Andrew's considerable fortune. Family members relied on oil lamps for illumination and chamber pots rather than modern bathrooms. Visitors frequently remarked that the home seemed surprisingly plain for a man of Andrew Borden's financial standing. To Andrew, however, thrift represented virtue rather than embarrassment. Every dollar saved strengthened the fortune he had spent decades building. Living with Andrew was his second wife, Abby Durfee Gray Borden. Abby had married Andrew several years after the death of his first wife, Sarah Morse Borden, who had died when the couple's daughters were still young. Abby entered the household hoping to create stability, yet she never fully earned the affection of Andrew's daughters. Lizzie Andrew Borden, who was 32 years old in the summer of 1892, reportedly refused to call Abby mother, instead referring to her as Mrs. Borden. Her older sister, Emma Lenora Borden, shared similar feelings. While there is little evidence of constant open hostility, surviving accounts suggest that emotional distance defined the relationships inside the house. Abby attempted to fulfill her responsibilities as wife and homemaker, but she remained something of an outsider despite having lived with the family for years. Lizzie herself presented a fascinating contrast to the grim image that would later dominate newspaper headlines. She was active in her church, taught Sunday school, participated in charitable organizations, and maintained friendships with respectable women throughout Fall River. Those who knew her socially often described her as intelligent, well-spoken, and devoted to religious work. Nothing in her public life suggested the violence that would later become associated with her name. Yet beneath that respectable exterior existed growing frustrations. Unlike many women of similar social standing, Lizzie remained unmarried into her 30s. Historians continue debating whether this reflected personal choice, limited opportunities, or the restrictive environment created by her father's controlling personality. Whatever the reason, she remained financially dependent upon Andrew despite being an adult woman. Family tensions increasingly centered on money and inheritance. Andrew had provided financial assistance to members of Abby's family, purchasing property for one of her relatives. Lizzie and Emma reportedly viewed these transactions with suspicion, fearing that assets they expected to inherit might gradually pass into the hands of their stepmother's relatives instead. Property ownership became an emotionally charged subject within the household. At one point, disputes over real estate reportedly became serious enough that Andrew transferred ownership of another property to his daughters in an apparent effort to ease growing resentment. While this temporarily reduced conflict, underlying distrust remained. Daily life inside the Second Street house followed strict routines shaped largely by Andrew's habits. Meals occurred at regular hours. Household duties were carefully assigned. The family employed a live-in servant, Bridget Sullivan, an Irish immigrant often referred to by the nickname Maggie, although historical records indicate her actual name was Bridget. She handled cooking, cleaning, laundry, and countless domestic chores required to maintain the household. Bridget later described an atmosphere that was orderly but not especially warm. Family members often kept to themselves, moving through separate parts of the house with limited conversation. Emma, Lizzie's older sister, happened to be away visiting friends during the days leading up to the murders, leaving only Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, and Bridget inside the residence. In retrospect, investigators and historians have wondered whether Emma's absence created circumstances that altered the household dynamic at a crucial moment. During the days immediately before August 4th, several members of the family experienced illness. Reports suggested they suffered stomach problems after eating leftover food, prompting fears that someone might have attempted to poison them. Although doctors at the time attributed the illness to spoiled food, the coincidence would later attract enormous attention once investigators began exploring possible motives. Rumors spread quickly through Fall River that someone inside the house had anticipated violence long before the murders occurred. Whether those rumors reflected genuine warning signs or the natural tendency to reinterpret ordinary events after tragedy remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding the case. Witnesses also recalled subtle signs that relationships inside the Borden home had become increasingly strained. Lizzie reportedly confided to friends that she felt uneasy in the days before the killings. According to later testimony, she mentioned concerns that enemies of her father might seek revenge because of his business dealings. Some historians interpret these comments as evidence that she genuinely feared outside threats. Others believe the statements may have been attempts to establish the possibility of an unknown intruder before investigators began asking difficult questions. The historical record cannot answer that question with certainty. What is clear is that beneath the quiet routines of the Second Street household lay unresolved tensions involving inheritance, trust, emotional isolation, and long-standing resentment. To neighbors passing the modest home on warm August mornings, nothing appeared extraordinary. The family continued attending church, conducting business, and following familiar routines. Yet within hours, those routines would be shattered forever. The events of August 4th, 1892 would transform an ordinary summer morning into one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, leaving behind a mystery that investigators, historians, forensic experts, and true crime enthusiasts continue debating more than a century later. The sun rose over Fall River on Thursday, August 4th, 1892, bringing with it another warm and humid New England morning. Nothing about the weather hinted that before noon, one of the most infamous crimes in American history would unfold inside the modest Borden residence at 92 2nd Street. The household followed a routine that had become almost mechanical through years of repetition. Every family member had established habits, and on that morning, those habits would later become the foundation of one of the most carefully examined timelines in criminal history. Investigators, journalists, historians, and legal scholars would spend generations attempting to reconstruct each movement, each conversation, and each passing minute in the hope of discovering what really happened inside the house. Around 6 o'clock, the family began stirring. Bridget Sullivan, the live-in servant, rose early as usual to begin preparing breakfast and carrying out the endless domestic chores expected of her. Born in Ireland before immigrating to the United States, Bridget had worked for the Bordens for several years and understood Andrew Borden's strict expectations regarding cleanliness, punctuality, and economy. Despite feeling unwell from the stomach illness that had affected several members of the household during the previous days, she continued her duties. She later testified that the heat made her feel especially uncomfortable that morning, adding another layer of exhaustion to an already demanding workload. Andrew Borden awoke and prepared for another day devoted to business matters. Although wealthy enough to retire comfortably, he remained deeply involved in managing his investments and routinely conducted meetings, collected rent from tenants, and visited various properties around Fall River. His disciplined habits rarely changed. Abby Borden also rose early, attending to household matters before breakfast. Lizzie Borden joined the family later that morning. By all outward appearances, the breakfast proceeded without dramatic confrontation. The meal reportedly included coffee, cookies, Johnny cakes, and mutton left over from previous days, the same leftovers some family members had blamed for their recent illnesses. Conversation, according to surviving accounts, remained limited. The Bordens were not known for a lively family. Breakfasts filled with laughter or lengthy discussion. Instead, each person quietly ate before turning attention toward the day's responsibilities. Shortly after breakfast, Andrew prepared to leave the house for his customary morning business rounds. Before departing, he spoke briefly with family members and then stepped outside, carrying the confidence of a man following an ordinary schedule. Witnesses later confirmed seeing him walking through the neighborhood as expected. His routine took him to several familiar locations where he conducted business with acquaintances who knew him. Well, nothing about his behavior suggested he believed danger awaited him at home. Abby's plans for the morning differed. According to testimony presented later, she informed Bridget that she had received a note asking her to visit a sick friend. The mysterious note immediately became one of the most puzzling aspects of the investigation because it was never found, despite extensive searches of the house. No witness could positively identify who had delivered it, and no sick friend ever came forward to confirm sending such a message. Some investigators believed Abby had invented the explanation for another purpose. Others suspected the note had existed but disappeared during the confusion following the murders. Historians remain divided because no conclusive evidence has ever resolved the question. Around 9 o'clock, Bridget began washing the outside windows of the house, a physically demanding task made more difficult by the oppressive summer heat. She moved between the yard and the exterior walls carrying buckets of water and cleaning cloths while periodically entering the house for supplies. Her work required concentration, and she later admitted that she paid little attention to movements inside the residence. This detail would become critically important because the prosecution and defense later debated whether someone could have entered or left the house without Bridget noticing. Meanwhile, Abby reportedly went upstairs. According to investigators' reconstruction, she climbed to the guest bedroom on the second floor where she began making the bed and performing light housekeeping. It was there, sometime between approximately 9 and 9:30 a.m., that she was attacked. Medical evidence later indicated she suffered numerous blows from a sharp instrument, believed to have been a hatchet or similar weapon. The first strike apparently came from behind, giving her little or no opportunity to defend herself. Additional blows followed with extraordinary violence. Abby collapsed beside the bed, falling face down onto the floor. Blood spread beneath her body, yet because the attack occurred in an upstairs room isolated from the rest of the house, no one immediately discovered the crime. Bridget continued cleaning outside, unaware that a brutal murder had already taken place only a short distance away. One of the greatest mysteries concerns Lizzie's whereabouts during this period. Her own statements varied over time. At different moments, she claimed to have been downstairs, in the kitchen, in the barn, searching for fishing sinkers, or performing various ordinary tasks around the property. These inconsistencies would later become a central focus of police questioning because investigators struggled to establish a reliable account of her movements while Abby was being killed. No witness could independently verify every detail of Lizzie's version of events. Nevertheless, no one actually reported seeing her commit the crime. This absence of direct eyewitness testimony would later prove enormously significant during the trial. After completing several business visits, Andrew Borden returned home at approximately 10:30 a.m. His arrival created another curious episode in the timeline. Finding the front door locked, he attempted to enter, but encountered difficulty. Bridget, having finished washing windows, came from inside to unlock the door. During later testimony, she recalled hearing what she believed was laughter from somewhere inside the house while she struggled with the stubborn lock. She could never confidently identify who laughed or precisely where the sound originated. The observation fascinated investigators because Abby was already dead by that time. Emma was away from home, and only Lizzie should have been inside. Whether Bridget accurately heard laughter or merely misremembered events after the trauma remains impossible to determine, but her statement became one of the most frequently discussed details in the case. Once inside, Andrew removed his coat, changed into a pair of comfortable slippers, and settled onto the sitting room sofa to rest. He had apparently decided to take a short nap before continuing with the day's activities. Lizzie later claimed she spoke briefly with her father, mentioning that Abby had gone out after receiving the mysterious note about visiting a sick friend. If Andrew accepted this explanation, he likely had no reason to search upstairs, leaving Abby's body undiscovered only one floor above him. Bridget, exhausted from working in the heat and still feeling ill, asked permission to lie down in her attic bedroom. Andrew agreed. She climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor and rested. According to her testimony, she remained there for some time, hearing no screams, cries for help, or sounds of violent struggle. Medical experts later suggested Andrew's attack occurred while Bridget rested upstairs. At approximately 11:00 a.m., someone struck Andrew repeatedly with a hatchet-like weapon while he lay sleeping or resting on the sofa. The first blow landed with devastating force, followed by numerous additional strikes directed mainly at his face and head. The attack was astonishingly violent, leaving injuries so severe that responding officers initially struggled to recognize him. Unlike Abby's murder, which occurred in relative isolation, Andrew's killing took place on the first floor near the front of the house in broad daylight. Yet, despite neighboring homes standing nearby and people moving through the streets outside, no witness reported hearing screams or obvious signs of violence. Investigators concluded the assault must have been swift and overwhelmingly powerful. Only minutes later, Lizzie called for Bridget, shouting that someone had killed her father. Bridget hurried downstairs to find Andrew lying motionless on the sitting room sofa, covered in blood. Shocked and confused, she rushed to assist, while neighbors quickly responded after hearing the commotion. One of the first to arrive was Alice Russell, a close friend of Lizzie, along with nearby residents who entered the house to offer help. A physician, Dr. Bowen, who lived only a short distance away, was summoned immediately. After examining Andrew, he confirmed there was nothing anyone could do. During the confusion, Lizzie appeared distressed, but composed enough to answer questions. She told those present that she believed her father had been attacked while she had been outside or elsewhere on the property. When someone asked where Abby was, Lizzie repeated that her stepmother had gone out earlier after receiving a note. Yet, as concern grew over Abby's unexplained absence, a neighbor suggested searching the house. Bridget and another witness climbed the stairs toward the guest bedroom. There, lying face down beside the bed in a pool of dried blood, they discovered Abby Borden's body. The horrifying realization spread instantly through the house. This was not a single murder, but a double homicide committed within the same home only a short time apart. Before noon, the quiet routine of the Borden household had ended forever, replaced by a crime scene unlike anything Fall River had ever experienced. Police officers rushed toward 2nd Street, knowing they faced a mystery that would challenge every assumption they possessed about motive, evidence, and guilt. The questions were immediate and deeply unsettling. Who had entered a respectable family's home in broad daylight? How had 2 brutal murders occurred without attracting attention? Why had nothing apparently been stolen? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if there had been no forced entry and no obvious escape, who inside that quiet house truly knew what had happened during those fatal hours? The discovery of 2 bodies inside the Borden home transformed an ordinary residence on 2nd Street into the center of one of the most perplexing criminal investigations in American history. Within minutes of the alarm being raised, police officers, physicians, neighbors, and reporters began arriving at the house. What they found immediately convinced them that this was no burglary gone wrong and no random act of violence. 2 members of one of Fall River's best-known families had been killed inside. Their own home in broad daylight, and almost nothing about the crime made sense. Andrew Borden was found first. He was lying on the sitting room sofa where he had apparently settled down to rest after returning from his morning business errands. His coat had been removed, and he had changed into a pair of comfortable slippers, suggesting he believed his workday was temporarily over. Nothing indicated that he expected danger. Medical experts later concluded that the attack had been sudden and overwhelmingly swift, leaving Andrew with virtually no opportunity to defend himself or summon help. The position of his body suggested that he had remained where he was first struck, a detail that immediately caught investigators' attention. There were no overturned chairs, no obvious signs of a struggle, and nothing to suggest a desperate attempt to escape. While officers secured the downstairs rooms, concern quickly shifted to Abby Borden, whose whereabouts remained unknown. Lizzie explained that her stepmother had supposedly left the house earlier that morning after receiving a note asking her to visit a sick friend. Yet, as more neighbors gathered, someone suggested searching the upper floor just to be certain. Bridget Sullivan and several others carefully climbed the staircase toward the guest bedroom. There they made the second horrifying discovery. Abby Borden was lying on the floor beside the bed, and it was immediately clear that she had died long before Andrew. Unlike the downstairs scene, evidence indicated that considerable time had passed since her death. Physicians would later estimate that Abby had likely been killed roughly an hour and a half before her husband, making one fact unmistakably clear. The murders had not happened together. Whoever committed the crimes either remained inside the house for an extended period or somehow left and later returned without attracting attention. That realization transformed the investigation from a tragic double homicide into an extraordinary mystery. Dr. Seabury Bowen, the family physician and medical examiner, Dr. William Dolan conducted the first examinations of both victims. Although forensic science in 1892 lacked fingerprint analysis, DNA testing, blood typing, or modern crime scene reconstruction, the doctors were able to determine several important facts. Both Andrew and Abby had died from repeated blows delivered by a sharp-edged instrument consistent with a hatchet or small axe. The injuries strongly suggested that the attacks had been deliberate and personal rather than accidental or impulsive. The medical findings also reinforced the conclusion that Abby had died first, followed much later by Andrew. That timeline would become the foundation upon which every later theory rested. Detectives immediately began searching every room of the house. They expected to find evidence of forced entry or signs that a burglar had searched for valuables. Instead, they encountered something far more puzzling. Doors and windows appeared secure. Furniture remained in place. Valuable possessions had not been taken. Andrew Borden's wallet still contained money, and jewelry inside the house appeared untouched. If robbery had not been the motive, investigators needed another explanation. The absence of theft suggested that the killer's purpose had been directed specifically at the victims themselves. The search soon extended to the basement, where officers discovered several household tools, including axes and hatchets commonly used for cutting wood or performing routine maintenance. One hatchet immediately attracted attention because its wooden handle had been removed, leaving only the metal head. Investigators wondered whether someone had intentionally altered it to disguise its appearance. Despite careful examination, however, the available forensic methods could not conclusively identify it as the murder weapon. Historians continue debating whether police had actually recovered the weapon or merely found an ordinary household tool that happened to appear suspicious after the fact. Another mystery quickly emerged. Given the nature of the attacks, detectives expected that whoever committed the murders would have been visibly stained with blood. Yet no obvious bloodstains were observed on Lizzie Borden's clothing during the initial investigation, and Bridget Sullivan's appearance matched her account of spending the morning washing windows. If the murderer had remained inside the house, where had the blood-stained clothing gone? Had it been hidden, burned, changed, or was investigators' understanding of the attacks incomplete? The questions multiplied far faster than the answers. Police then turned their attention to witness interviews. Bridget carefully described her morning routine, explaining how she had spent hours cleaning the outside windows before resting in her attic bedroom because she felt ill from the oppressive heat. She insisted she heard nothing unusual until Lizzie called for help after discovering Andrew's body. Neighbors confirmed seeing Andrew leave the house that morning and later return at approximately the expected time. None reported seeing a stranger entering or fleeing the property. Lizzie herself gave several accounts of her own activities during the crucial hours. She explained that she had been performing household tasks and had spent time near the barn looking for fishing sinkers before planning a future fishing trip. Although none of her statements directly admitted involvement, investigators noticed that certain details changed during repeated questioning. At first, these inconsistencies seemed understandable for someone who had just witnessed a terrible tragedy. As interviews continued, however, detectives began wondering whether the differences reflected confusion, fading memory, or something more troubling. Outside the Borden home, crowds continued growing throughout the afternoon. Curious residents lined the sidewalks while newspaper reporters hurried to gather information before telegraphing stories across the country. Within hours, newspapers in Boston, New York, and beyond were publishing dramatic headlines describing the mysterious killings in Fall River. The combination of wealth, respectability, family conflict, and unexplained violence captivated the public almost immediately. It was a story unlike any most Americans had ever encountered. As daylight faded on August 4th, investigators reviewed everything they had learned. 2 people had been murdered inside the same house nearly 90 minutes apart. There was no convincing evidence of forced entry. Nothing valuable appeared to have been stolen. No neighbor had seen a suspicious stranger. The household itself contained only a handful of people, each offering an account that left important questions unanswered. The evidence seemed to point in conflicting directions, and every theory created new problems instead of solving old ones. Among all those who remained alive after the tragedy, one person increasingly stood at the center of investigators' attention. The quiet, church-going daughter who had called for help that morning would soon find herself answering far more difficult questions as police began examining not only what had happened inside the Borden house, but also who had the motive, opportunity, and means to commit one of the most infamous crimes in American history. The investigation moved with remarkable speed, but almost from the beginning, detectives found themselves returning to the same unavoidable question. If no stranger had been seen entering or leaving the Borden house, and if there was no convincing evidence of a robbery or forced entry, then who inside the home could have committed the murders? Although police initially considered several possibilities, their attention gradually centered on one person more than anyone else, 32-year-old Lizzie Andrew Borden. The shift in focus did not happen because investigators uncovered a single decisive piece of evidence. Instead, it resulted from a growing collection of circumstances that, taken together, appeared increasingly difficult to ignore. In the hours immediately following the murders, Lizzie spoke with police officers, neighbors, physicians, and family friends. At first, her behavior struck some witnesses as calm considering the tragedy she had just experienced. Others believed she appeared nervous, confused, or emotionally detached. Such observations were highly subjective, and different people remembered her demeanor in different ways. Some later insisted she showed remarkable self-control under extraordinary pressure, while others felt her reactions seemed strangely restrained. These conflicting impressions would later become part of the public debate, illustrating how the same behavior could be interpreted in entirely different ways depending on one's expectations. More significant than her demeanor were the statements she made about the events of the morning. Detectives quickly noticed that certain details changed as she was questioned repeatedly. Lizzie explained that she had been in different locations around the property during the crucial period when Andrew was killed. At various times, she said she had been in the kitchen, outside near the barn, or inside the barn searching for lead sinkers to prepare for a future fishing trip. She also mentioned eating fruit while there, despite the oppressive summer heat. Investigators found these explanations difficult to reconcile with the timeline established by witness testimony and medical evidence. They questioned why anyone would spend time in a hot, dusty barn during one of the warmest parts of the day, particularly after complaining of feeling unwell only days earlier. While none of these inconsistencies proved guilt, they raised doubts about the reliability of her account. Another detail soon attracted the attention of investigators. Several days before the murders, Lizzie had reportedly visited a local pharmacy in an attempt to purchase prussic acid, a highly toxic substance commonly used for cleaning furs and other industrial purposes. According to the pharmacist's later testimony, Lizzie asked whether she could buy the poison, explaining that she needed it for household use. Massachusetts law required a prescription or a legitimate business reason for purchasing such a dangerous chemical, and the pharmacist refused to sell it to her. The prosecution would later argue that this incident suggested premeditation, proposing that Lizzie may have initially considered poisoning her parents before ultimately resorting to a hatchet. The defense strongly disputed the testimony, pointing out that no poison had been used in the murders and questioning whether the pharmacist had accurately identified Lizzie. Even so, the alleged attempt to obtain poison became one of the most widely discussed pieces of circumstantial evidence in the entire case. Detectives also began examining the relationships within the Borden household more closely. Friends and relatives described years of tension involving money, inheritance, and Andrew Borden's extreme frugality. Although Andrew possessed considerable wealth, he refused to adopt the comfortable lifestyle enjoyed by many of his equally prosperous contemporaries. Lizzie and her sister Emma reportedly grew increasingly frustrated with their father's unwillingness to modernize the family home or provide the social standing they believed their financial position deserved. Additional resentment centered on Andrew's financial generosity toward Abby Borden's relatives. When he transferred valuable property to members of his wife's family, Lizzie and Emma reportedly viewed the decision as a threat to their future inheritance. Although Andrew later transferred other property to his daughters in an apparent effort to restore balance, investigators believed lingering bitterness may have remained beneath the surface. These family disputes did not establish motive by themselves, but they provided a possible explanation for why someone within the household might harbor deep resentment. Another development added to the growing suspicion. On August 7th, 3 days after the murders, family friend Alice Russell visited the Borden home. During her visit, she observed Lizzie standing near the kitchen stove while burning a blue cotton dress. When Alice questioned why the dress was being destroyed, Lizzie reportedly explained that it had been stained with old paint and was no longer worth keeping. At the time, clothing was frequently repaired, repurposed, or discarded when damaged, so the explanation was not inherently unusual. Nevertheless, Alice later informed investigators about the incident because the timing seemed troubling. If the dress had contained evidence related to the murders, destroying it would have been highly suspicious. The defense countered that multiple witnesses confirmed the dress had indeed been stained with paint before the killings, and that there was nothing unusual about disposing of worn clothing. Because the garment had already been burned, police could never examine it, leaving historians to debate its significance for more than a century. Investigators searched Lizzie's bedroom and personal belongings, but failed to uncover blood-stained clothing or other direct physical evidence linking her to the murders. They also found no written confession, no eyewitness testimony placing the weapon in her hands, and no reliable evidence that she had attempted to flee after the crimes. Instead, the case remained almost entirely circumstantial. Each suspicious circumstance seemed important when viewed individually, yet none alone established guilt beyond reasonable doubt. This created a frustrating dilemma for detectives. They believed the available evidence increasingly pointed toward Lizzie, but they lacked the conclusive proof needed to eliminate every alternative explanation. Public opinion, however, began shifting far more rapidly than the official investigation. Newspapers across the country seized upon the extraordinary possibility that a respectable, unmarried Sunday school teacher from a prominent New England family might have murdered both her father and stepmother. Victorian society viewed women as naturally gentle, nurturing, and morally superior to men. The notion that a woman of Lizzie's background could commit such a violent crime challenged deeply held cultural assumptions. Some newspapers portrayed her as a cold and calculating killer hiding behind an appearance of innocence. Others defended her fiercely, arguing that public prejudice and sensational journalism had unfairly transformed an innocent woman into the nation's most famous suspect. Every rumor, every witness statement, and every new development received extensive coverage, fueling nationwide fascination with the case. Police also explored alternative theories. Could a disgruntled business associate have targeted Andrew? Detectives interviewed individuals connected to his financial dealings, but found no compelling evidence. Could a burglar have entered the house unnoticed? The lack of stolen property. And forced entry made that explanation increasingly difficult to support. Some investigators briefly considered whether Bridget Sullivan could have been involved, given her presence in the house throughout the morning. Yet her account remained largely consistent, and no convincing motive emerged. Others suggested that an unknown intruder might have hidden inside the house before striking both victims, though this theory required explaining how such a person escaped without being seen despite the close proximity of neighboring homes. Each alternative seemed possible in theory, but encountered serious practical difficulties when compared with the known facts. As detectives reviewed the evidence, they returned repeatedly to the same conclusion. Lizzie had been inside the house during the crucial period. Her statements contained inconsistencies. She allegedly attempted to purchase poison shortly before the murders. She destroyed a dress only days afterward. Family tensions involving inheritance had been well documented. Although none of these facts proved she had committed the murders, together they formed a pattern that investigators believed could not be ignored. On August 11th, exactly 1 week after the killings, Lizzie Borden was arrested and formally charged with the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. The decision sent shockwaves across the United States. For many Americans, it was almost unimaginable that a woman of her social standing could stand accused of such a crime. Yet for investigators, the evidence, however circumstantial, had narrowed the field of suspects until only one name remained at the center of the investigation. The quiet daughter who had summoned help on that August morning would now face the full weight of the American justice system in what was destined to become one of the most sensational murder trials of the 19th century. The arrest of Lizzie Andrew Borden on August 11, 1892, instantly transformed a local homicide investigation into a national spectacle. Newspapers across the United States devoted front-page coverage to nearly every development, publishing lengthy articles that mixed factual reporting with rumor, speculation, and dramatic illustrations. The idea that a respectable unmarried woman from a prominent New England family stood accused of murdering her father, and Stepmother challenged Victorian beliefs about gender, morality, and domestic life. Crowds gathered outside courthouses, journalists competed for exclusive interviews, and the public eagerly debated whether Lizzie was a cold-blooded killer or an innocent woman trapped by circumstance. Long before the trial officially began, the case had already become one of the most talked-about criminal investigations in American history. Before facing a jury, Lizzie first appeared at a preliminary hearing where prosecutors outlined the evidence they believed justified sending the case to trial. During this early stage, investigators emphasized the lack of forced entry, the conflicting statements Lizzie had given about her activities on the morning of the murders, the reported attempt to purchase prussic acid shortly before the killings, and the destruction of the blue cotton dress several days afterward. Prosecutors argued that while no eyewitness had seen the murders take place, the totality of the circumstantial evidence pointed toward only one reasonable conclusion. The defense, however, immediately challenged both the reliability and the legality of much of the state's evidence, laying the groundwork for what would become one of the era's most closely watched legal battles. The grand jury formally indicted Lizzie Borden in December 1892, and her murder trial began on June 5, 1893, at the Bristol County Superior Court in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Because of the extraordinary public interest, every available seat in the courtroom filled quickly. Journalists from major newspapers across the country attended daily proceedings, filing detailed reports that allowed readers hundreds of miles away to follow each witness, objection, and legal argument almost in real time. The trial lasted 2 weeks and became a defining moment in American legal history, not simply because of the murders themselves, but because it highlighted the growing importance of forensic evidence, courtroom procedure, and the influence of public opinion on high-profile criminal cases. Lizzie assembled an exceptionally experienced defense team. Among her attorneys was former Massachusetts Governor George D. Robinson, whose reputation and courtroom skill immediately strengthened her position. He was joined by accomplished lawyers, Andrew V. Jennings and Melvin O. Adams. Together, they pursued a strategy that focused less on proving Lizzie's innocence than on demonstrating that the prosecution could not establish her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They repeatedly reminded the jury that suspicion, no matter how strong, could never substitute for proof. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Hosea M. Knowlton and Attorney General Albert E. Pillsbury, both respected legal. Figures determined to persuade the jury that the circumstantial evidence formed a consistent and compelling picture. They argued that the murders required someone with intimate knowledge of the house, someone able to move freely without attracting suspicion, and someone with both motive and opportunity. According to their theory, Lizzie fit that description more closely than anyone else, yet they also faced an enormous challenge. Unlike many murder cases, they possessed no confession, no eyewitness, no fingerprint evidence, no blood-stained clothing, and no murder weapon conclusively linked to the defendant. Every major point depended upon inference rather than direct proof. One of the earliest controversies involved Lizzie's statements made during police questioning in the days immediately following the murders. At that time, she had been questioned extensively while under the influence of morphine prescribed by her physician to calm her nerves. The defense argued that any inconsistencies in her answers resulted from confusion, trauma, and medication, rather than deception. The judges ultimately ruled that much of her inquest testimony should not be presented to the jury because the circumstances under which it had been obtained were unfair. This decision significantly weakened the prosecution by removing some of its strongest evidence regarding Lizzie's contradictory accounts. Witness after witness then took the stand. Bridget Sullivan described the family's routine on the morning of August 4th, recounting her window washing, her brief rest in the attic, and Lizzie's desperate call announcing that Andrew had been killed. She remained composed throughout questioning, and although her testimony established the basic timeline of events, it did not directly implicate Lizzie. Neighbors testified about seeing Andrew leave and later return home according to his normal schedule. Physicians explained their medical findings, confirming that Abby had died well before Andrew and that both victims had been killed by repeated blows from a sharp instrument consistent with a hatchet. Yet none of these witnesses could identify the killer. The pharmacist who claimed Lizzie had attempted to purchase prussic acid shortly before the murders also appeared in court. Prosecutors viewed this testimony as evidence of planning, suggesting that Lizzie had initially intended to poison her father and stepmother before choosing another method. The defense objected vigorously, arguing that no poison had been used in either murder, and therefore the alleged purchase attempt had little relevance. After careful consideration, the judges agreed and excluded the testimony from the jury's consideration. The ruling removed another important piece of the prosecution's circumstantial case and illustrated the court's determination to prevent speculative evidence from influencing the verdict. Equally controversial was the issue of the burned dress. Alice Russell testified that she had seen Lizzie burning a blue cotton dress only days after the murders, and that Lizzie explained it had been ruined by paint stains. Prosecutors implied that the dress may have contained incriminating evidence. The defense responded by presenting witnesses who confirmed that the garment had indeed been stained before the murders and argued that destroying old clothing was neither unusual nor suspicious. Because the dress no longer existed, neither side could prove its claims conclusively. Once again, the jury was left weighing competing interpretations rather than definitive facts. The physical evidence presented during the trial proved equally inconclusive. Investigators displayed the hatchets recovered from the Borden basement, including the handleless hatchet head that had attracted attention during the investigation. Yet no scientific method available in 1893 could establish beyond doubt that any of these tools had inflicted the fatal injuries. Modern forensic techniques, such as DNA analysis, microscopic blood detection, and advanced trace evidence examination did not exist. As a result, the alleged murder weapon remained only a possibility rather than a certainty. Throughout the proceedings, the defense repeatedly emphasized this lack of conclusive physical evidence. George D. Robinson delivered a carefully crafted closing argument that appealed both to logic and to the legal principles governing criminal trials. He reminded jurors that the burden rested entirely upon the prosecution. It was not Lizzie's responsibility to prove her innocence. Instead, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had to prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, a standard intentionally designed to prevent convictions based on suspicion alone. Robinson argued that while the murders were undeniably horrific, horror could not replace evidence. He urged jurors to separate emotion from fact, and to remember that every unanswered question in the case created reasonable doubt rather than certainty. Prosecutors countered by asking jurors to consider the totality of the evidence. They argued that each suspicious circumstance, when viewed independently, might appear insignificant, but together they formed a coherent pattern. Lizzie had been inside the house during the critical period. Her explanations had changed repeatedly. Family tensions over inheritance were well documented. The alleged poison purchase and the destruction of the dress added further reasons for suspicion. According to the prosecution, coincidence could explain one or two unusual facts, but not so many occurring together. The jury retired to deliberate on June 20th, 1893. Public anticipation reached extraordinary levels as newspapers waited anxiously for the decision. Many observers expected lengthy deliberations given the complexity of the evidence and the unprecedented nature of the accusations. Instead, after approximately 90 minutes, the jurors returned to the courtroom. Their remarkably brief discussion suggested that they had reached agreement with surprising speed. The clerk asked for the verdict. The foreman stood and announced a single word that echoed through the packed courtroom and across the nation. Not guilty. Lizzie Borden had been acquitted of the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. Legally, the case against her had ended, yet outside the courtroom, in newspapers, homes, and public conversation throughout America, the debate over what had truly happened inside the Borden house on August 4th, 1892, was only beginning. The jury's verdict of not guilty ended the criminal case against Lizzie Borden, but it did not end the questions surrounding the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. On June 20th, 1893, after deliberating for little more than an hour, the 12 jurors concluded that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Their decision reflected one of the most fundamental principles of the American legal system. Suspicion alone, regardless of how compelling it might appear, could never justify a conviction for murder. The prosecution had presented numerous suspicious circumstances, yet it had failed to produce direct evidence linking Lizzie to the killings. There was no eyewitness who saw her commit the murders, no confession, no blood-stained clothing recovered by investigators, and no murder weapon conclusively identified through the limited forensic methods available in the 19th century. Faced with these uncertainties, the jury chose acquittal. The verdict immediately divided public opinion. Outside the courthouse, some observers celebrated what they believed was justice. Friends and supporters insisted that an innocent woman had survived an unfair prosecution driven by sensational newspapers and public prejudice. Others reacted with disbelief. Many Americans had followed every stage of the investigation and trial through detailed newspaper coverage, and they found it difficult to accept that such a brutal double murder could remain officially unsolved. Editorials appeared across the country arguing both sides of the controversy. Some praised the jury for respecting the high legal standard required in criminal cases, while others claimed that the law had failed to deliver justice for Andrew and Abby Borden. Even within Fall River itself, opinions remained sharply divided. Although the courtroom had declared Lizzie innocent in the eyes of the law, many residents quietly continued to believe she had escaped conviction. Shortly after the trial, Lizzie and her older sister Emma inherited Andrew Borden's substantial estate. The inheritance transformed their financial lives almost overnight. They sold the modest 2nd Street house that had become infamous throughout America and purchased a much larger residence in one of Fall River's more fashionable neighborhoods. The elegant home on French Street reflected the lifestyle that Andrew had largely denied himself despite his considerable wealth. Lizzie named the house Maplecroft, a name intended to symbolize a fresh beginning. The sisters filled it with comfortable furniture, modern conveniences, artwork, books, and decorative items that would have been unthinkable under their father's famously frugal management. To many observers, Maplecroft represented freedom from years of financial restraint. To others, it stood as an uncomfortable reminder that the primary beneficiaries of Andrew Borden's fortune had also been the principal suspects in his murder. Despite her acquittal, Lizzie never truly escaped public suspicion. Visitors frequently slowed their carriages outside Maplecroft, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman, whose name had become synonymous with one of America's greatest criminal mysteries. Curious tourists occasionally appeared uninvited, eager to see the infamous house or perhaps even speak with its owner. Newspapers continued publishing stories whenever any new rumor emerged, ensuring that Lizzie remained a subject of public fascination long after the trial ended. In an age before radio or television, her name became one of the most recognizable in the nation. Although many Americans had never visited Massachusetts, they knew the story of Lizzie Borden and the mysterious murders on 2nd Street. Social acceptance proved far more difficult than financial security. Some longtime acquaintances maintained friendly relationships with Lizzie, believing she had been wrongly accused or simply choosing to respect the jury's verdict. Others avoided her entirely. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent, and whispers often followed her whenever she appeared in public. Victorian society placed enormous importance on reputation, and few reputations had suffered greater damage than Lizzie's. Even without a criminal conviction, the mere association with such an infamous case created barriers that could never fully disappear. Children reportedly repeated a skipping rhyme that spread rapidly across the United States. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. The verses were historically inaccurate in several respects. Abby Borden was Lizzie's stepmother rather than her biological mother, and neither victim suffered the exaggerated number of blows described in the rhyme. Nevertheless, its simple rhythm ensured that generations of children remembered the story, further embedding the case in American popular culture. Lizzie herself rarely spoke publicly about the murders after the trial. She granted few interviews and generally avoided discussing the events of August 4th, 1892. Those who encountered her later in life often described a woman determined to live as normally as possible despite the extraordinary burden of public suspicion. She devoted time to charitable causes, cared deeply for animals, and maintained friendships with a relatively small circle of trusted companions. Among these friends was actress Nance O'Neill, whose close relationship with Lizzie generated considerable gossip in Fall River. Although there is no conclusive historical evidence regarding the nature of their friendship beyond what contemporary sources describe, local rumors contributed to Lizzie's growing isolation from much of respectable society. Emma Borden remained loyal to her younger sister for many years following the trial. Together, they managed Maplecroft and attempted to rebuild their lives. Yet, in 1905, an unexpected development added another layer of mystery to the Borden story. Emma moved out of Maplecroft and never again lived with Lizzie. The sisters, once inseparable, became permanently estranged. Neither publicly explained the reason for their separation. Historians have proposed numerous theories, ranging from disagreements over Lizzie's friendships to long-standing personal conflicts that finally reached a breaking point. Because neither sister left a detailed explanation, the true cause remains unknown. Their silence has encouraged decades of speculation, but produced no definitive answers. Lizzie continued living at Maplecroft for the remainder of her life. Although financially comfortable, she never escaped the shadow cast by the murders. Every anniversary of the crime revived newspaper interest. Writers produced new articles, books, and theories examining the evidence from fresh perspectives. The case gradually evolved from a criminal investigation into an enduring historical mystery. As advances in forensic science transformed homicide investigations during the 20th century, many observers wondered whether modern techniques might have produced a different outcome had they existed in 1892. Yet because much of the original physical evidence had been lost, destroyed, or improperly preserved according to contemporary standards, those questions could never be fully answered. Lizzie Borden died of pneumonia on June 1st, 1927, at the age of 66. 9 days later, Emma Borden also died after years of living separately from her sister. They were buried in the Borden family plot at Oak Grove Cemetery in Fall River, not far from Andrew and Abby. Even in death, the family remained linked by a tragedy that had forever altered American criminal history. No one was ever convicted of the murders, and with Lizzie's death, the possibility of hearing her complete account of the events disappeared forever. Legally, she remained an innocent woman in the court of case. Public opinion, however, the verdict never settled the matter. Decades passed, yet historians, criminologists, legal scholars, and true crime researchers continued examining every surviving document, witness statement, and piece of physical evidence. Each new generation brought fresh theories and renewed debate. The question that had first confronted investigators inside the Borden house on that hot August morning remained unanswered. If Lizzie Borden did not kill Andrew and Abby Borden, then who did? And if she did, how had one of the most closely watched murder trials in American history ended with an acquittal? Those enduring questions ensured that the Borden case would never fade into history as merely another unsolved crime. Instead, it became one of the world's most enduring criminal mysteries, inviting every generation to reconsider the evidence and decide for itself what truly happened behind the doors of 92 2nd Street. More than a century after the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden, the case remains one of the most intensely debated unsolved crimes in American history. Despite thousands of pages of testimony, newspaper reports, police records, and historical research, no theory has succeeded in answering every question raised by the events of August 4th, 1892. Modern historians generally agree on one important distinction that was often blurred by sensational newspapers of the era. The documented facts are relatively few, while the speculation surrounding those facts has grown enormously over the decades. The known evidence establishes that Andrew and Abby Borden were murdered inside their home with a hatchet-like weapon, that Abby was killed first, that Andrew was attacked roughly 90 minutes later after returning home, that there was no convincing evidence of forced entry or robbery, and that Lizzie Borden was arrested, tried, and acquitted because the prosecution failed to prove guilt, beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond those established facts lies a landscape filled with competing theories, each offering possible explanations while leaving important questions unanswered. The most widely discussed theory remains that Lizzie Borden acted alone. Supporters of this conclusion argue that she possessed both motive and opportunity. They point to the long-standing family tensions over inheritance, resentment toward her stepmother, dissatisfaction with her father's strict control of the household, her inconsistent statements during the investigation, the reported attempt to purchase prussic acid before the murders, and the destruction of the blue dress after the killings. They also emphasize the practical difficulties facing any outsider. The Borden house stood in a busy neighborhood during daylight hours, making it remarkably difficult for a stranger to enter, commit two murders separated by more than an hour, and leave unnoticed. Advocates of this theory believe the lack of forced entry strongly suggests that the killer either belonged inside the house or was willingly admitted. Some historians have further suggested that Lizzie may have changed clothing immediately after the attacks and disposed of incriminating evidence before police conducted a thorough search. Yet this theory also faces significant challenges. No eyewitness ever saw Lizzie commit either murder. No bloodstained clothing was recovered. No murder weapon was conclusively linked to her. Modern legal scholars often note that even today, a prosecution built entirely upon the available evidence would face substantial obstacles. The absence of direct proof remains the strongest argument raised by those who question her guilt. Another theory proposes that an unknown intruder committed the murders. According to this explanation, the killer may have been someone with a personal grievance against Andrew Borden, perhaps connected to one of his business dealings, property disputes, or financial decisions. Andrew's reputation as a strict businessman had undoubtedly earned him critics over the years. Supporters of the intruder theory argue that the mysterious note allegedly received by Abby on the morning of the murders could indicate that someone deliberately lured her upstairs before attacking. They also point to the fact that many houses in 19th century America were left unlocked during parts of the day, making quiet entry theoretically possible. However, critics of this theory emphasize the extraordinary risks involved. Remaining inside the house for approximately 90 minutes while waiting for Andrew's return would have required remarkable confidence and luck. Escaping afterward without attracting the attention of neighbors, Bridget Sullivan, or anyone else in the vicinity would have been equally difficult. No credible witness ever reported seeing a suspicious stranger leaving the property, and no physical evidence clearly supported the presence of an outsider. A third possibility suggests that more than one person may have been involved. Variations of the family conspiracy theory have appeared repeatedly since the 19th century. Some versions speculate that Emma Borden, although away from Fall River during the murders, may have possessed knowledge never revealed to investigators. Others suggest that an unidentified accomplice helped carry out the attacks or assisted in concealing evidence afterward. These theories attempt to explain how two murders could occur in the same house without leaving more obvious traces behind. Yet, historians generally regard such claims with caution because no reliable documentary evidence has ever demonstrated that multiple conspirators participated in the crime. Most versions depend heavily upon speculation rather than surviving historical records. Bridget Sullivan has also appeared periodically as an alternative suspect. Because she was present in the house throughout the morning, some writers have questioned whether investigators dismissed her involvement too quickly. A few speculative accounts suggest that years of demanding work under Andrew Borden's strict management could have created resentment. Others imagine that she may have confronted one or both victims during an argument that escalated unexpectedly. Still others propose that Bridget unknowingly assisted the real killer by leaving portions of the house unattended while washing windows or resting in the attic. However, these ideas encounter serious evidentiary problems. Bridget's testimony remained largely consistent from the earliest interviews through the trial. Investigators found no convincing motive and no physical evidence connected her to the murders. Most modern historians therefore consider her an unlikely suspect, despite the occasional revival of such theories in popular books or documentaries. Over the years, researchers have proposed numerous other alternative suspects as well. Some have suggested that a disgruntled former employee, an angry tenant, or a business rival sought revenge against Andrew Borden. Others have speculated about an unidentified relative or acquaintance whose connection to the family has been exaggerated over time. A few highly imaginative theories even introduce entirely fictional scenarios unsupported by any historical documentation. While these proposals often attract public attention because they offer fresh perspectives, they rarely withstand careful examination of the surviving evidence. Most rely upon assumptions for which no contemporary records exist, highlighting the difference between historical investigation and creative speculation. One reason the Borden case continues to fascinate historians is the remarkable gap between 19th century investigative methods and modern forensic science. When the murders occurred, fingerprint analysis had not yet become standard police practice in the United States. DNA testing, blood typing, luminol, microscopic trace evidence analysis, surveillance cameras, and digital communication all lay decades in the future. Officers did their best using the scientific knowledge available in 1892, but many opportunities that modern investigators would consider essential were simply unavailable. Important pieces of physical evidence were handled without gloves, moved before thorough documentation, or discarded according to practices considered acceptable at the time. As a result, even today's forensic experts cannot re-examine much of the original evidence because it no longer exists. Historians therefore face the difficult task of interpreting incomplete records while recognizing the limitations under which the original investigators worked. Equally important is distinguishing documented fact from enduring myth. popular culture has often distorted the case, sometimes unintentionally and sometimes for dramatic effect. The famous skipping rhyme claiming that Lizzie gave her stepmother 40 blows on her father 41 is entirely inaccurate. Medical examinations documented far fewer injuries, and Abby Borden was Lizzie's stepmother, rather than her biological mother. Likewise, many stories repeated in novels, films, and television programs have no basis in the historical record. Responsible scholarship requires separating contemporary evidence from legends that developed years or even decades later. This distinction explains why historians sometimes disagree, not because they interpret the same facts differently, but because they differ over which sources deserve the greatest trust. Today, the Borden house still stands in Fall River, preserved as one of America's most famous historic crime scenes. Visitors from around the world come to learn about the investigation, examine the layout of the rooms, and better understand the events that unfolded there on that hot August morning in 1892. Museums, archives, universities, and independent researchers continue studying original documents in the hope that overlooked details might shed new light on the mystery. Although occasional claims of breakthrough discoveries appear in books or documentaries, none has produced the conclusive evidence necessary to resolve the case beyond reasonable doubt. The murders of Andrew and Abby Borden therefore remain officially unsolved. The enduring legacy of the Borden case extends far beyond the question of who committed the murders. It reshaped public attitudes toward criminal investigations, demonstrated the enormous influence of newspaper coverage on legal proceedings, and became one of the earliest examples of a true crime story capturing sustained national attention. It also serves as a reminder of the difference between legal guilt and historical suspicion. A jury declared Lizzie Borden not guilty because the evidence presented in court did not satisfy the demanding standard required for a criminal conviction. That verdict has never been overturned, and under the law, she remained innocent for the rest of her life. Whether she was also factually innocent is a question that history has never answered with certainty. More than 130 years later, the mystery still invites careful examination rather than easy conclusions. Every generation reviews the same testimony, studies the same photographs, analyzes the same timelines, and weighs the same competing theories. Yet the final answer remains elusive. Perhaps that is why the story continues to endure. It is not merely a tale of two tragic murders, but a case that illustrates the limits of evidence, the power of reasonable doubt, and the enduring fascination of unanswered questions. Until new evidence emerges, an outcome that grows less likely with each passing decade, the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden will remain one of America's greatest criminal mysteries, a haunting reminder that even the most famous investigations do not always end with certainty, and that some chapters of history continue to challenge our understanding long after the people who lived them are gone.